Let me say, before I begin, there will be spoilers for both The Calling and The Stolen Throne, Dragon Age Origins, Dragon Age 2, Dragon Age Inquisition, and the comics. So please, if you have an actual interest in reading or playing any of these things, leave before you're spoiled. Have you left if you don't want to be spoiled? Okay, good. Let me also say that while I'm not graphic in my speaking of it, there are trigger warnings for rape, childhood sexual abuse, torture, slavery, and murder. The Calling is not a good book. It is an interesting book. Let us start with that. The Calling has interesting characters and an interesting plot, but it's not a good book in the slightest. David Gator's first Dragon Age book, The Stolen Throne, was also not a good book, but it was a better book in that it stuck with a plot of Prince tries to retake his throne, a fairly common trope in fantasy stories. Because of this structure, he can focus more on his characters, where he really shines, instead of trying to build the plot. Mark, Logain, and Rowan are all fully developed characters who one can tell have rich interior lives. Catriel has less of one, but that's understandable given Catriel's main role in this story, even if it's tired and trite, is as a temptress towards Mark. She's not as dynamic of a character because odds are good for much of the book. Mark is more in love with the idea of who she is than who she actually is. But in The Calling, Gator attempts to strike out onto less well-tread ground, and while I commend him for his efforts, because of this, much of what he tries fails. He doesn't have a solid structure from which to base his story. Now, I will say before I start that I've likely read The Calling more than probably anyone else in the fandom. I've listened to the audiobooks from chapter 1 to the epilogue at least 13 times and read sections of the book in general looking for quotes I needed to support meta at least 60. I probably like The Calling more than most people in the fandom, but it's not a good book. So, briefest summary possible of The Calling. A Grey Warden has apparently been kidnapped by the Darkspawn. This is bad news because he knows the location of all the untainted old gods. But good news, the Grey Wardens are pretty sure he's in Orton Tig. Even better news, both Tyrion Logan McTeer and King Mark Theron have been there. Bad news though, these Wardens are Orlesian, and Logain hates Orlais, and they plan to have Logain lead them. Good news, Mark, who is suffering from fairly severe depression due to the death of his wife, Queen Rowan, and who probably hopes this trip will kill him, decides to run off with the Wardens to be their guide. There are 3 major flaws to this story in my opinion, which is what I will start with. Then I'll comment on the things I feel it does well. Then I'll end with a few nitpicky flaws which, while not major, do harm the book. There are, I would say, 5 major women in this book. There's Genevieve, the Warden Commander. She's human and Orlesian. Utha, a senior warden. She's dwarven and a former Silent Sister. Catriel, a character from the previous book, a former elven lover of Marek, who Mark killed after it was revealed she was a bard spying on the rebels from Megran, the Orlesian usurper of Marek's throne. She defected at this point, but for a number of reasons she was killed anyway. Rowan, one of the 3 main protagonists from the previous book, and Marek's wife, who died of an unknown illness before the start of The Calling, and whose death has left Marek in a major depressive episode. And Fiona, an elven mage with a difficult past and Marek's current love interest. I would also say that Gator doesn't give much of a story to any of these women. He gives the idea of a story to most of them, but he doesn't do as much with it as he could have. Genevieve had what could have easily been an interesting story if it had been fleshed out. The Grey Warden who'd been taken prisoner is her brother. She and her brother have been very close for many years and even took the joining together. It's her dream of her brother which made her convinced the man's been taken in the first place. She also recently lost her lover, who'd been murdered by Duncan. Yes, that Duncan. He was a thief and ended up getting caught by the warden, and had to kill him. The warden who was Genevieve's lover, I should clarify. Genevieve decided to join him rather than let him get executed for it. But Gator does very little with that. The fact that Bregan is her brother does way more to further his plot and his arc than it does to hers. The same thing with Duncan killing her lover. It plays way more into Duncan's arc, where when she tells him she wanted him to be joined in the hopes it would kill him, upsets him rather than for her arc. She essentially stays a very similar character for most of the book. Utha suffered quite a bit as a character too. As a disabled woman who communicates only through sign language, which none of our three POV characters can understand well, she's mostly ignored by the plot until she chooses to join with the architect, the Darkspawn who kidnapped Bregan himself, and Genevieve. Catriel appears as a spirit in the Fade when Mark becomes imprisoned. I don't think Gator failed with her as a character, but I am uncomfortable with what he did to her. While it's unclear if Fade Catriel is real Catriel's spirit, Gator had this woman, or at least Fade Spirit's impression of her, help the man who violently murdered her, a man who'd been her lover, which is uncomfortable to say the least. Rowan appears in the book also as a posthumous character. Her death has caused Mark to fall into a deep depression. She doesn't die in battle as one would expect, or even of, say, childbirth or a simple malady, but of a disease, a wasting sickness, which neither magic nor medicine could treat. Mark was certain it was the blight despite it fitting no symptoms of the blight. I personally think it's a genetic disorder, and I hope that one of her brothers, Eamon or Tegan, being a carrier, comes into play in future games just to make her death more important than it is in the Calling. Because in the Calling, it really feels like the only reason she's dead is because Gator didn't want Mark cheating on her. And because he wanted to give Mark man pain to motivate him. I unsurprisingly think Fiona is the most complex and developed of the women characters, but it feels like she only got that way by fighting, kicking, and screaming at the writer the whole time to keep her agency. Fiona's story is that she hates nobility and is triggered by Mark because she was the sex slave of a Norwegian count, now stylized as Comte, in the Dragon Age games, from the time she was 7 to the time she was 14, when she killed him and was sent to the Circle, which the book actually has her say was barely better than slavery. She's a strong, capable character, and we rarely get to see people who are adult survivors of childhood sexual assault in the media. Most of the media acts as though we disappear the moment we come of age. The problem is how we get this information. Namely, Fiona is possessed by a demon, and all the others are trapped in the fate along with her. And that Marek, Duncan, and the other wardens see the abuse she suffered. There are a couple things about this that bother me, even more so than this normally would. Firstly is the fact that I know Gator can reveal a character's traumatic backstory that involves sexual violence well. He does it in The Stolen Throne. He has Logan reveal his mother was raped and murdered in front of him by Orlesians, and he was forced to watch when he was a little child. We're not forced to see Logan's pain. A person who triggers him, say an Orlesian noble, is not privy to the reveal of what happens. Logan uses his pain as a cudgel with which to make Rowan leave him alone. He is allowed, as a character, to have this pain and to experience this pain and to decide who he tells about this pain. Instead, with Fiona, Gator has her become possessed, has Fiona lose autonomy over her body again, just so we can see that she's lost her autonomy before. And not only that, but her colleagues and a man who triggers her, Marek, all see what happened to her. They all see it. Second is that the scene is very sexualized. It feels as though Fiona's body, her pain, is on display for us in a manner that's supposed to be titillating. Thirdly, the scene's not in Fiona's POV. It's in Duncan's. One of the problems I have with writers who write sexual violence scenes is that they tend to take a POV other than the victims. They focus on what's happening in a way that feels voyeuristic. We tend to see the rape from the point of view of a third party. And the problem with that is it tends to not show you what rape is actually like for the person being raped. And that's what Gator did. He had Duncan be the POV character. Duncan comments on how almost arrogantly handsome, those are the actual words used, Fiona's master was. And it just felt to me more like he's like, oh, I want to date this guy, than, oh, this guy is abusing my friend. I have no doubt that if the scene was from Fiona's POV, it would show more of what she remembers from the abuse she suffered, and it wouldn't be about how arrogantly handsome her former master was. I bet she remembers the 2 bricks in the wall that had a gap in the mortar between them and how she used to stare at it. I bet she remembers all kinds of stuff that make it very clear what happened was about power rather than about sex, rather than about this man being angry and torturing her because he's angry. That scene, many of the flaws with it would have been wiped away if it had been from Fiona's point of view. But it wasn't. It was from Duncan's. Another problem is the fact that nearly every other character was their younger selves in their fantasy. The only ones I know for sure weren't were Genevieve, who was still a different self in her fantasy, and Nicholas, who I believe was the same age he was for the rest of the book in his fantasy. And because Gator doesn't clarify if Fiona is adult Fiona or child Fiona, which would honestly make more sense in that scene considering everyone else was de-aged, leaves us to make that assumption for ourselves, which is very uncomfortable to me, because as somebody who has suffered through similar things, I tend to assume it's child Fiona, and that's really upsetting. Also, Fiona doesn't rescue herself from the Count as she did in real life. Instead, Marek delivers the killing blow to the demon impersonating the Count. Finally, no one offers any comfort to Fiona afterwards. Not Duncan, who so far is the closest thing Fiona has to a best friend. Not Marek, who will soon become her love interest. Not her commander. Not Kel. Not Utha. Not even Hafta, as far as I remember. And he's a dog. Like, dogs can tell when somebody's not doing well. He should offer her some comfort, at least. The rest of the book is, for the most part, not about Fiona's past, despite us seeing it. It's about her learning that nobles are sometimes a-okay. It's about her helping Marek get over his guilt for killing Catriel, who I will remind you is also a Norwegian elf like Fiona, and who, as far as I remember, Fiona doesn't know was a spy. And I don't know about you, but if I was Fiona and I found out Marek killed a woman from my country, of my race, he was lovers with, for, as far as I know, no reason, I'd run the other direction. Deep roads or no deep roads. She and Marek also hook up so that Alistair is born, and she's cured of the blight too, without her wanting to be. My biggest problem is that Fiona's agency, something she's clearly been fighting for most of her life, is taken away from her. She's possessed by a demon and loses her autonomy. She's forced to reveal the past abuse she suffered to a man she doesn't trust and is triggered by, and to her co-workers. The taint is forced from her blood. She's forced, because of racism in her society, to give up her son to keep him from facing bigotry and oppression. And sometimes between the calling and asunder, she's forced to leave the wardens and return to the circle, which I will remind you, she said was hardly an improvement to being a literal slave. A rape survivor's agency and body autonomy are taken from her over and over and over and over again in the books. And all of these things could have been very easy to fix. Having Fiona's rape scene, or rather her torture scene, from her POV rather than Duncan's. The demon thing, I can understand why that's there, and I can't think of an easy fix. But Fiona being forced out of the wardens, she could have simply chosen to leave the wardens after she was cured, deciding it was best for her to go and help other circle mages. Instead, it's canon she was forced out. All of these things were easy fixes. Another problem I have with the book is structure. The Calling is a very hard book to summarize because Gator kept switching between the Wardens and Bragan and the Architect, and because the book seems filled with padding it didn't need, trying to create some kind of structure with which to use the characters on. The fight scene with the dragon seems to be there only to give Duncan's dagger an enchantment against dragons in DAO and have Julian get killed. The demonic possession is only there to show us the backstories of the characters, primarily Fiona, and to have Nicholas get killed. The fight with Vermeil feels a lot longer than it should have been. The pacing of the Stolen Throne felt a lot tighter, and the cutaway to the primary antagonists in that book, Severin, Megran, and Mother Bronick, felt a lot more logical and not superfluous. That's a hard word to say. Sorry. Third, and this is not a problem with the book itself, but with DAI, I hate how you have to read all the side books to fully understand the personalities and backstories of the characters who appeared in the books and then in the game. Fiona is a former slave. You know that if you've read the books. You know and understand fully how hard a choice it must have been for her to make, to either die or accept the yoke of slavery again. But BioWare doesn't let us know about that in the game. To people who haven't read the book, she just looks like a shitty leader. I also strongly dislike how fans tend to assume the Calling made Fiona Alistair's mother is a retcon, despite the fact that the Calling had been out longer than DAO. Now for things I liked. Marek's depression is portrayed realistically, and he's not vilified for his mental illness, which is something rare in BioWare games. Much of the lore is fascinating, and it'd be fun to see what they use and how they build on it. Seeing young Duncan really adds to his depth as a character in DAO, and his reasons for recruiting Alistair are made more clear. It also, in my opinion, makes his desire to kill Logain more interesting, because I think if he'd known exactly how Duncan got recruited, he would want to recruit Logain instead of kill him. Speaking of Logain is amazing as always, interesting, complex, and works wonderfully with Marek, especially the snark he uses against him. He's not there for most of the book, but he's there for major moments, and it really adds to the story. The architect is sufficiently interesting as the antagonist, as in Shamil, and even though their love plotty story thing doesn't really feel completely meshed yet, I really like the idea of Fiona and Marek together. Now, more small things I don't like. I don't like a lot of the subtle racism in the book. Duncan is called swarthy, which is not a great word for characters with dark skin, as it's often used to mark them as villainous, something Gator uses it for in The Stolen Throne. There's also the fact that Duncan wishes for lighter skin, which, while yes, is interesting in that it shows Thetis has colorism the same way the real world does, it's still uncomfy to read because Gator's a white dude and he doesn't know exactly how to write it. There's also the fact that Fiona's physical appearance is very inconsistent. In the beginning of the books, she's said to have brown hair, and that's really the only thing other than her big brown eyes that we know about her in terms of physical appearance. And all throughout the books, the only time she's called pale is when she's in a situation where she's lost a lot of blood or is physically exhausted until the very end of the book, at which point she's described as pale and sunburned, which, while it still does make sense in that she's telling Marek about his son and that might have caused her to have nerves, it's still a very weird thing to drop on us. There's a lot of inconsistencies in terms of how she's supposed to physically appear. I personally went with one of my friends on Tumblr. Her name is in the description. Her art of Fiona as a warden for the background of this video, because that's personally how I headcanon her looking. Also, there's sex in the Deep Roads again, which is always super creepy. And the fact that, again, Marek is participating in said Deep Road sex makes it seem like he's got a really weirdly specific kink. There's also the fact that that the narrative tries to paint Marek's interest in Fiona as some kind of elf kink developed after Catriel's death, when honestly, other than being a Norwegian elf, Fiona is far more like Logain than Catriel. In terms of personality. I saw no real point to the story about the elven sex worker hired for Julian. I thought it was meant to make Fiona uncomfortable, in that later the slur they used towards that woman was also used for her when she described exactly why the Comte had bought her as a child. But again, that section isn't from her POV, so that doesn't work. It honestly might have worked if the POV character had noticed her discomfort, but they didn't. Finally, it bugs me that Fiona had been a warden for longer than Duncan, yet just before Kel makes his sacrifice, he puts Duncan in charge of getting Fiona, Marek, and Duncan himself out of the Deep Roads. Fiona hasn't been cured yet. There's no reason to put Duncan in charge instead of Fiona. She's been a warden for longer. She should be the one put in charge. No, The Calling isn't a masterpiece. Yes, I have many problems with it. No, it's not a good book. But as I said above, it's interesting. So if you have the chance and aren't triggered by the content, please read it. I made this video mostly to tell you to read The Calling because I am lonely, being one of very few Fiona fans in the fandom.